fear of fear. I hate being scared to do something. It's very simple. This is what I believe, and I'm willing to die for it. Yeah. Period.
After Earth wasn't simply a box office failure. It began to be seen as the first sign of cracks in Will Smith's almost infallible image. While the media quickly blamed director M. Night Shyamalan and Jaden Smith's inexperienced performance, behind-the-scenes information told a much more complex story. This wasn't a project Will Smith merely participated in. It was one he actively promoted, directed, and placed great faith in. And when it failed, the box office guarantee began to show its first cracks. But Hollywood, as usual, doesn't stop at one failure. After Earth, Will Smith returned to more commercially successful projects, attempting to reassert his A-list star status. However, instead of a strong comeback, the results became more erratic. Some films still grossed well, but they no longer reached the level of cultural phenomenon they once were. The numbers no longer guaranteed the absolute success they enjoyed during the Golden Age. By the mid-2000s, the change began to become more apparent. Will Smith's script choices became more controversial. Highly anticipated projects failed to live up to expectations, and each time the reasons given were the same: weak script, underqualified director, changing market. But over time, those explanations began to sound similar. Films like Suicide Squad and Collateral Beauty continued to add to the list of projects that fell short of expectations. While each film had its own circumstances, the common thread was the discrepancy between expectations and actual results. Meanwhile, Will Smith's image off-screen remained almost unchanged. Still a friendly, likable star, always maintaining his appeal to the public. But this very separation began to create a paradox. Within the industry, the question gradually arose: did Will Smith's appeal truly guarantee box office success as before? Or was it merely a relic of a bygone era? And then things went beyond just the realm of film. By the end of the decade, when Gemini Man was released and continued to disappoint commercially, the story of Will Smith was no longer just about the success or failure of each film. It began to become the story of a star trying to maintain his position in a system that had changed far too rapidly since the era he once dominated. And in that context, what happened afterward only made the picture more complicated. Gemini Man, a science fiction action film with CGI technology rejuvenating the main character. In theory, this was a groundbreaking idea. Will Smith confronting a younger version of himself. The concept was both action-packed and had the potential to explore a character depth, but reality didn't live up to expectations. The film was directed by Ang Lee, a name previously associated with works rich in artistic merit and pioneering visual techniques. However, the combination of this directorial style and the structure of a blockbuster action film did not produce the desired effect. Gemini Man debuted with high expectations, but was quickly criticized for its simplistic script, lack of pacing, and especially its controversial, youthful CGI effects, which, instead of making an impression, distracted many viewers. Global box office revenue was only average compared to its large production and marketing costs, and the film quickly faded from popular culture discussions afterward. The noteworthy aspect wasn't just the film itself, but the market's reaction. Once again, Will Smith's name no longer carried the same box office guarantee as before. It still attracted attention, still generated expectations, but no longer guaranteed success. And during this period, a pattern began to repeat itself more clearly. After Earth was a failure blamed on its family and creative elements. Focus was a safe bet, but failed to make an impact. Collateral Beauty was an attempt at art house cinema, but received negative reactions. And Gemini Man was an attempt to combine technology with an A-list star, but it still failed to create a breakthrough effect. Each project has its own context, Each project has its own reasons for not succeeding as expected. But when looking at the overall picture, a trend is becoming clearer. The gap between Will Smith's personal fame and the actual effectiveness of the films he participates in is widening. No more cultural event hits like before. No more numbers that grab the attention of the entire industry. Only average results remain, alternating between high expectations and a gradually cooling market reaction. And then, a project that seemed poised to reverse this trend emerged: King Richard. A biographical film with a budget of approximately $50 million, telling the story of Richard Williams, the father of Venus and Serena Williams. Directed by Ronaldo Marcus Green and backed by Warner Brothers, the film was clearly positioned as a strong contender for awards season. Under normal circumstances, this could have been a perfect comeback for Will Smith in the drama genre. But the context was completely different. The film market was heavily impacted by the pandemic. Theaters were no longer operating stably, and Warner Brothers' simultaneous theatrical and streaming release model had dispersed box office revenue. King Richard opened with a domestic revenue of only about $5.7 million, a modest figure, reflecting the changing market more directly than the film's quality. And once again, Will Smith's story is placed in a more complex context. It's not just about the film's success or failure, but about the entire system changing faster than the status of a star once considered a box office guarantee. King Richard ended its box office run with approximately $39 million worldwide, a figure that, under any normal circumstances, would be considered a clear failure. But the context was everything. The pandemic created a shield for the box office results. Warner Brothers' hybrid theatrical and streaming release strategy also complicated the assessment. And most importantly, Will Smith's performance in the film was undeniable, a critically acclaimed role that ultimately earned him the Best Actor Oscar. The moment Will Smith stepped onto the stage to receive his Oscar was seen as the culmination of a journey to redeem his image. After years of skepticism regarding his project choices, he finally achieved a clear artistic triumph. Hollywood almost completed the story. A star had overcome a slump and returned to his rightful place. But a closer look at the data reveals a more complex narrative. King Richard didn't achieve the box office success that a prestige film starring Will Smith could easily achieve in the past. Its success lay more in streaming, awards, and critical acclaim, rather than in its theatrical release. This raises a difficult question. If released under normal conditions, would audiences have flocked to theaters as they did before? There's no definitive answer, but the studio's subsequent silence speaks volumes. Warner Brothers isn't rushing to launch similar projects with Will Smith. The seemingly complete recovery has only paused, not reversed, the previous trend. And then everything fell apart completely. Emancipation. A project worth approximately $120 million, acquired by Apple during a period of film market stagnation. The film was expected to be a serious historical work, with a large-scale and award-winning ambitions. But instead of becoming a cinematic event, it was handled in a completely different way. After the incident at the 94th Academy Awards, when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock on stage, the entire approach to his image in the industry immediately changed. Emancipation was no longer seen as an event film. It became a project that needed careful handling to minimize media risk. The film was released in limited theaters with no strong promotional campaign, no prominent red carpet, and almost no press activity from Will Smith. As a result, global revenue only reached about $14 million. A very low figure compared to production costs and initial expectations. Apple TV Plus then moved the film to its streaming platform, where it could reach audiences without the pressure of box office or mainstream media. And while the film was put in the safe zone, the industry's reaction to the whole affair became colder and more cautious than ever. Will Smith is no longer seen as a safe bet for the box office. Instead, he's been redefined as a risky asset, a name that can be controversial, unpredictable, and no longer guarantees the same business success as before. In the eyes of studios, his value has shifted structurally. He's no longer a box office opening star, but an asset better suited to the streaming environment, where viewership numbers replace opening weekend revenue, where media risk can be better controlled, and where financial failure isn't immediately exposed to the public. The $120 million Apple TV Plus spent on Emancipation no longer signifies an investment in Will Smith's cinematic future. It's more like an acquisition of a stake in the brand, rather than a bet on attracting audiences to theaters. Looking back at the entire run of 6 films spanning over a decade, a very clear pattern begins to emerge. It's no longer a series of random failures. It's a gradual process of incompatibility between a star and the system he once dominated. Excuses dwindle. Reasons become less convincing. And when the Oscar slap happens, it's not the cause of the collapse. It's the moment that exposes the full extent of the decline that had been underway. The question now isn't whether Will Smith can return to his peak. It's whether he can return to the box office system he once was. The failures over the decade aren't isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a structural disconnect between Will Smith and the very industry that propelled him to the top. The formula that built his empire isn't outdated in the simple sense. It became outdated because the world around him changed. To understand the fall, one must understand the rise. Will Smith's career was built on a very clear understanding. Audiences don't just watch his characters. They want to be with him. From The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to Bad Boys, then Independence Day, the formula was always the same. A smart, charming man with clear morals who always wins through charisma rather than ruthlessness. He didn't play villains. He didn't exploit moral gray areas. He was almost always the safest man in the room. For 3 decades, that worked perfectly. But then that safety began to turn into predictability, and the industry began to celebrate the opposite. Actors who completely transformed themselves in their roles, who dared to annoy audiences, whose faces were hard to read and difficult to control. Christian Bale, Joaquin Phoenix, Adam Driver, all represented a new standard, not liked, but unpredictable. Even in mainstream films, names like Robert Pattinson and Zendaya began to balance commercial appeal with artistic eccentricity. Meanwhile, Will Smith maintained his old image. The pursuit of happiness was touching, but safe. Ali had physical transformations, but didn't create psychological instability. And even King Richard was softened to be more relatable than edgy. Audiences began to seek the unexpected. But Will Smith became the most predictable thing in Hollywood. Will Smith isn't the only one being pulled off course, but he's the clearest example of how Hollywood has restructured its entire star ecosystem. What was once considered a box office guarantee no longer holds up without a franchise, a strong IP, or a streaming release strategy. In this context, Smith continues to develop projects that evoke a bygone era, an era where a big name could single-handedly carry an entire film. But audiences have changed. They either seek out massive blockbusters or smaller, deeply personal works. The middle ground, where Will Smith once reigned, is gradually disappearing from theaters. Economically, the Will Smith package model is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The approximately $20 million salary, plus post-production fees, a producing role, and creative control, was designed for a time when his films easily surpassed $500 million in global revenue. But the current reality is quite different. Recent projects have only grossed around $150 to $200 million. Even Emancipation has only performed very poorly at the box office. In the eyes of studios, the question is no longer, will Will Smith be a box office success, but whether the risk is still worth the profit. And increasingly often, the answer is no. The Oscars didn't cause this decline. They only made it undeniable. For the preceding decade, Hollywood had been quietly adjusting expectations for Will Smith. But the blow removed the most crucial buffer, public adoration. From that point on, he was no longer a safe star, but a risky variable in every calculation. The question gradually shifted. Could he be promoted without mentioning the event? Could his face be on a poster without generating a negative reaction? For most studios, the answer was no, and Hollywood reacted in the coldest way possible. Silence. Projects were delayed, plans were scaled back, discussions vanished from the development calendar. Will Smith wasn't officially dropped, he simply wasn't a priority anymore. Hollywood doesn't operate by emotion, but by precedent. And the new precedent, formed from a prolonged downturn, combined with the Oscar shock and the failure of Emancipation, has produced a clear conclusion. The era of box office guarantee stars is over. In the new system, projects like I Am Legend 2 stalled, and expansions of old franchises like Aladdin were no longer pushed as aggressively as before. Instead, Will Smith's future was reshaped. Average films for streaming, art house or personalization projects, and roles in available franchises to reduce risk. It was still a viable career, but no longer at its peak. Streaming can pay well, but it no longer creates the cultural icons that the box office once did. Contractual power has also shrunk. Lower budgets, more shared risk, limited creative control, and everything tied to actual performance. Even Will Smith's role as a producer is no longer as absolute as it once was. In the theatrical film space, he's only suitable for projects with established, strong brands. The rest have moved to streaming. And from that emerges an unspoken reality. Will Smith's decline isn't just a financial story, but a cultural shift. The audience that once created a global star is now fragmented, and the kind of star who can fit in everyone has almost disappeared. Hollywood has reached its own conclusion, not to wait for his return, but to build a system where he is no longer the center.